I'd like to talk about the essential nature of the self. And attribute to that essential nature the term freedom. And what I mean by that is that the self is free per se. It's not qualified by anything, it's not freedom from anything, but it's an objective, absolute, ultimate state of freedom. So the self has its being and existence within freedom, and spiritually speaking that's referred to as the One. So within the One the self is free, which means that whatever environment the self exists within, that means the environment of the body, the environment of nature, the environment of the universe, the environment of dreams, the environment of visions and imagination. The self is always one and free. So the one having a sense of openness and emptiness, by implication means that it's empty of all conditions, it's empty of all experiences, it's empty of all content. So wherever the self is in the One, it's free of all of those conditions and contents of the physical universe or universes, or of the psychic dimensions. So as I'm talking now, there is no doubt that I am myself. When I say I am myself, I'm using consciousness and language and identity to communicate this fact. So the I am is the identity within my consciousness that is conveying the fact of myself in communication. So if I say I'm sitting in a chair, then I'm saying the identity within my consciousness, the image of my body, the image of my language, the image of my personality and my persona is sitting in the chair. So it's describing the environment of self. So self is one, and in consciousness and in body, then the self is within an environment of identity. You have the identity of the body, and you have the identity of the language. So language, you might say, is a process of identification. So each letter, each word, each image and each number represents different forms of identity. So everything within consciousness and memory is a form of identification, and everything in the physical universe is a form of identification. So outside of the One, which is empty of identification, everything in reality is a form of identity. So if you're a scientist, and you're dealing with the Big Bang, you're dealing with genetic structures, you're dealing with quantum fields, you're dealing with brain processes, you'll be dealing with biochemistry, you're dealing with computers, you're dealing with thought, you're dealing with language. All of that exists, you might say, outside of the realm of the One. But because the One is empty of all content, therefore the space of the One enfolds all things in reality, all forms of identity. So the self, in effect, potentially can be anywhere in reality and always be itself, because it exists in the emptiness of the One. Self is not dependent on identity. Self is not dependent on the body. Self is not dependent on consciousness with its language, with its memory, with its experience and its knowledge. The idea that a computer can be made to have consciousness is quite possible, in the sense that a biocomputer, a computer that, say, is based on biology, chemistry, physics, quantum field, genetic structure, all of that, and maybe that kind of composition can create an artificial computer or an artificial entity that is a model or a replication of a conscious human being. So they talk about downloading consciousness into a machine. Of course, that would, in that sense, it doesn't matter to self whether consciousness is biological or consciousness is to do with physics, consciousness is to do with matter, consciousness is to do with any of those things. But I think that you'll have to bring in the principle of thought, which is rooted in the psyche, and that means psychic energy, etc. So I think that the only way you're going to make a biocomputer is to have a psychic component, which means that you'll have to understand the nature of thought and the nature of psyche, which I think exists in its own dimension. But because self is not dependent on memory, is not dependent on personality, is not dependent on language, so you might say that in society, in relationship, most people don't realize that when they share their personality with another person, they're not sharing their self. So there's a misunderstanding within the human being that the self is the same as identity, the same as the personality. So people might be in relationship and think they know each other, but what they actually know is the personality, is the memory which they recognize, and all the emotions and all the experiences that they share together. So in a sense, you might say relationship in essence never really works because the two selves are not in direct relationship with one another. They don't see eye to eye, i.e. the eye of the mind, no, the eye of spirit. They're not seeing eye to eye spiritually, they're seeing eye psychically in their identity. Just as you see eye to eye in the physical body. So I think that philosophically we have to make it clear that self is not identity. Self is not your name. Self is not your address. Self is not your behaviour. Self isn't what you communicate, what you know, and what you recognise. So if you take the field of consciousness, and it's the field of identity, the field of memory, the field of knowledge, the field of emotion, the field of that which is a psychic field, as it were, then when those two consciousnesses come into relationship, then it's always partial to that specific area or identity which is coming into relationship. So if you go to work in a museum and you're an art historian, then you work with other art historians and restore paintings, for example. And if you're a man and you fall in love with a woman and then you become a mother and father, they're all different forms of identity. You like going dancing, you like to go to a concert, you like to go to a museum, you like to go to the seaside. And again, you're sharing different aspects of identity. And over the years, you build up a memory in which lots of different aspects of identity are being shared. But there are lots of aspects of personality that's subconscious and unconscious in each person that surfaces and doesn't fit into the picture you've got of each other. There are contradictions, there are conflicting feelings that you have within yourself and you project onto the other person. So I'm saying that relationship through consciousness will never work out. You may build up a reasonable relationship and you modify the conflict, you modify the disagreement, you modify the behaviour so that you can live together, raise a family, etc., and feel that you've had a fairly good life. But it's always a compromise. It's always a matter of tolerating and adjusting to each other and adapting to each other. And what's not understood is that there can be a self-to-self relationship, but that can only come about if you distinguish the difference between self and consciousness. So if there is no actual self-awareness, then you'll never know that such a thing is possible. And when you read certain books, spiritual books, sacred books, and they talk about the liberation of the self, and you begin spiritual practices and you meditate, etc., etc., and trying to free the self from conditioning or free the self from consciousness, and you can't free the self from consciousness, because self has nothing to do with consciousness. So all of those spiritual practices are in vain. The self doesn't need to be free from consciousness. It's a matter of you, yourself, distinguishing yourself from consciousness. And because self is not consciousness, you can't become conscious of self, because self is in a completely different dimension. When you go to sleep and you're in a dream and you're dreaming, you're in a dream body, as it were, you're totally unaware that your body is asleep in the bed. So in the dream, you're in the dream and you're living that reality. And say you died in your body, say your body died when it was in bed, and you carried on in the dream, you wouldn't necessarily know any different, because in the dream you're not thinking and remembering your body in the bed. So people that actually do die could carry on in their consciousness, in their psyche, because consciousness is actually in the psychic dimension. It's not actually in the body, in the brain. So when you go into the dream, of course you don't think of your body, because your psyche dream is not dependent on the body. And I'm saying that just as the identity, the personality in consciousness is integral to the dream state, and that can exist independent of the body, and I'm saying the self is the same thing. The self is independent of consciousness in a spiritual dimension. So really, it's up to you, and only you can make the distinction within yourself between yourself and your identity. That you're not the student, you're not the artist, you're not the mother, you're not the son, you're not the husband, you're not the fireman, you're not the politician. That you're just acting your part on the world stage. So really, when it comes to the spiritual nature of self, which is the only real spiritual issue as far as I can see, then you either do it or you don't. And if you say, well, how do you do it? Well, you can only do it or you can't do it. Self is not a process. Self isn't dependent on anything but itself. So you can't think about it in your consciousness, because that's just an identity thinking about the self. So you're just thinking about yourself through the medium of an identity, which of course has no awareness of the self, because self is self-aware and is not the same as being conscious. So you can't be conscious of yourself. And because the self is one, you can't get to the self other than be yourself. You can't go to the self. There's no way to the self, which means there's no way to the one and there's no way to the spiritual dimension. There's nothing you can do about it in your consciousness and in your body. There's no means to get to the self. So first of all, the body can't do it, and consciousness can't do it. And when you see that, only you can do it. And what does that actually mean? Only you can do it. The thing is, you are it. You are the self. And self is self. And if you know yourself, as it were, then you're free. If you take consciousness to be a mirror, the hall of mirrors, and say you're a small child and you're taken to the fairground and you're left alone in the hall of mirrors and you get frightened, you get confused, you don't know the way out, you can't find your way out, and you see all these images and reflections, you don't realise that it's reflecting your body, and you're totally, you're frightened, in a panic, etc. And then suddenly someone comes along and takes you outside and you see your parents, and the whole illusion, the whole drama of your consciousness, your confusion, what they call Maya, the veil of illusion, all of that stops just like that, like a light goes on and the light goes off. And there's and in the child's consciousness of being in the hall of mirrors is immediately forgotten. And that's exactly the same. Once you yourself, you're free, then there is no more problem with your consciousness. And your consciousness, i.e. your identity as an artist, your identity as a parent, your identity as an English person, etc., etc., just goes on as normal. Nothing changes. You don't have to do anything. Just wake up. That's the only thing you can do. I mean, for me personally, that happens spontaneously without me knowing it. And suddenly I was aware of myself. I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. But once it happens, it's permanent. Once it happens, you're aware of yourself in freedom and in the spiritual dimension, so that you're not in your body and you're not in your psyche conscious. And there's nothing more to say. There's nothing more I can actually say. I don't know how it happened, why it happened. So no matter what they do in terms of consciousness and evolution and biocomputers, whatever they do in the future with artificial intelligence, etc., that has nothing to do with self, that has nothing to do with the spiritual dimension. So in a sense, I don't feel threatened by that. But if you're identified and you can't distinguish yourself from your identity, then if you're a religious person, you feel very threatened by that. Because you don't want to be cut off from God or from Christ or from the spiritual dimension. But if you know yourself, in the sense you perceive the reality of yourself, then that danger, that psychological threat is all over, it's finished. I would say nearly all of the spiritual, so-called spiritual processes in the mind-body area and meditation area has to do with consciousness, has to do with altered states of mind, and has nothing to do with the spiritual nature of the self. So I think people are deceiving themselves that they find their self through astral travel, through parapsychology, through meditation. They will never find their self. I mean, in the Grail legend, when Parsifal goes into the Grail castle, the Grail just appears out of nowhere. And in the morning, the following morning, he can't find anybody in the castle. And he thinks it was a dream, as if it was just a dream. The whole thing was like a fantasy. It's the same thing when, I mean, over the years I've seen UFOs. I've seen UFOs only 20 feet away, and they appear, and they're right in front of you, and you can look at them, and within a minute they go away, they just disappear. So if somebody said, well, what is a UFO? And I say, well, actually I don't know what a UFO is, but I know symbolically, mythologically, according to Carl Jung, the UFO is a symbol of the Grail vessel that appears and disappears. And in the same way that I was awakened to self, it just happened to me, I don't know why, and it just happens. And that's what they say about synchronicities, that's what they say about the paranormal, that's what they say about miracles. There are certain things that happen in reality that you can't give them a context, you can't place them within a specific environment. They can appear anywhere, at any time, all over the world, throughout the whole of history and prehistory. And you give the general term psycho-spiritual experience. That means psychic, spiritual experience. And to the materialist, to the evolutionist, to the, the idea of computers and such, artificial intelligence, all of that is superstition. All of that is a fantasy. Well, we know, we're fairly sure now today, given the sightings of UFOs, that they've been sighted for the last 70 years or so, all over the world, every day. So there is a phenomenon called UFOs that goes right back into history, even to the Egyptian period, 5,000 years ago, and they're called sunboats or solar boats. And we now know that there are exoplanets, that means water-bearing planets in other solar systems, that may indicate the presence of intelligent life. And if you say the UFO are from other dimensions or other planets, then we can assume that there are alien intelligences, and that's what all of the ancient civilization believed in. The Aboriginals, the Egyptians, that their ancestors, the mythical beings and the gods, came from other galaxies, other solar systems. And that seems fairly logical to me. I think that's more or less corresponds with my own intuition and my own experience. So if you think of a kind of spiritual intelligences within the one, what I would call enlightened beings, like the Buddha, for example, that exists in the one, or nirvana, on a transcendental level. I mean, my experience of spiritual dimension is only in the embodied state, in the here and now, in the immanent state. But I haven't gone beyond my body into the spiritual dimension, but I think it exists in a transcendental state. And you might say, to us on Earth, the alien intelligences on other planets, they are transcendent to the Earth, or in other dimensions. So I think that I've got fairly good evidence that these enlightened ones, or alien intelligences, are behind what happens to me in my life. So I've had synchronicities, UFOs, visions, that all translate as the you might say, the work of alien intelligences. But what they're doing to the human species, what they're doing to individual people, I have no idea what their agenda is, etc. But I've got no doubt that spiritual beings, as it were, are working with the human race in different ways. I mean, you might say, well, how did the Buddha become enlightened? And there's no way of knowing that. But certainly he finished, the story goes that he was studying the sacred texts. And then he became a yogi. And then he stopped being a yogi and he went probably back home where his family and friends were. And at some time he became enlightened. So I would say at some time he became self-aware. And that can just happen spontaneously. And then it was said that he enlightened other people, like a friend and one of his family members. So that would be, in my eyes, a self-to-self communion. He communed with the self of another person, and in some way that person's self was able to distinguish the difference between self and consciousness. And they call that the liberation from conditioning, because the consciousness is conditioned, and the liberation from the human condition. And if you go into a transcendental level, like the Buddha was supposed to be, then you would be free from the human condition, free from the human race, free from planet Earth. So you're no longer a human being living in history, as it were. So these alien intelligences on other planets, other dimensions, they may be like us, but once you leave the human condition, once you leave your own history behind, then obviously you're translating into a different kind of human being, or a different kind of being. So if you are self-aware, like I feel I am, and I was sitting with other people that were evolutionists, atheists, people in meditation, people that considered themselves religious or spiritual or scientific, etc., there would be no way that I would want to try to communicate my state of self-awareness. It would be totally futile using language and consciousness and experience. I mean, I can say all of these extraordinary experiences I've had, but that doesn't explain how I became self-aware. And because self is one and empty of content, therefore I only have myself to acknowledge in a way. So if I'm sitting with other people, I'm simply myself. And there's nothing I can do about making that apparent to anybody else. I can only use my consciousness and language, and it would seem pointless keeping referring to myself, which can't be communicated. So I really couldn't have a dialogue with anybody about the spiritual nature of the self. So if people are arguing about consciousness and computers and about religion and spirituality, and they've all got different opinions in their consciousness, different identifications. And for me, the spiritual nature of the self is a reality, and there's no way that you can come to that through consciousness, and other people are reducing self to a non-entity, so they're saying there is no self in the brain, there is no self in consciousness, or the self is identified with Christ, or the self is identified with God as an ideal state. So people's ordinary self is less than God. Their ordinary self is less than Christ or Buddha. Whereas for me, self is Buddha, is God, is Christ, is the One. So when people feel they've got to project or depend on or identify with a God or with Christ or Buddha, then they haven't distinguished between self and identity, and they're simply confusing their self with their identity. And of course your identity isn't the one, isn't yourself. But people aren't making that simple distinction. So that's the only thing I could say, is that, unless you make that distinction, then it's pointless what you say and what you do and what you meditate on in your consciousness, because you'll never find self, because you are yourself. There really is nothing to find or nothing to discover. You are yourself. But as long as the veil of illusion is masking that insight and understanding of the self, then you're perpetually lost in confusion and perpetually arguing the case as an evolutionist, an atheist, a theist, humanist, and people are all arguing, and it's just absolutely futile. The debate between religion and science is futile. And in science they probably will build a somewhat conscious entity, and maybe in the future people will build UFOs and travel non-locally across the galaxies and maybe have an artificial body and so forth and so on, and maybe their life expectancy will be thousands of years, we don't know. But those people will just be what they are, and they'll be identified with that. I mean, in the end, self has nothing to say about the human condition, about the human race, about the human species, about the universe, about the psyche. In the end, self is self. There's nothing to defend, there's nothing to protect. So what does it mean when you are self-aware and you see the human race in confusion about the nature of self, which is really a spiritual thing? So whether you call it a problem about God, a problem about Buddha, a problem about Christ, it's really only a problem within consciousness. And that problem can never be solved. So the spiritual perceptions of someone that's self-aware are love, truth, beauty, compassion, justice, and with that awareness of the world, of the human condition, of the confusion about the true nature of self, which is the spiritual so-called problem, then out in that freedom, you're not choosing to interfere with other people's autonomy, with other people's choices, with other people's beliefs in their consciousness. Because you know that no matter what you do with consciousness, no matter how you manipulate consciousness, as a scientist, as a politician, as a psychologist, as an artist, as a musician, however you manipulate, however you recreate and redesign and reconfigure consciousness, will never set you free. I mean, until the age of 23, when I became self-aware, I lived in my consciousness, I lived in my identity. I hadn't made the distinction between self and identity, and nothing was wrong. I mean, I just lived my life. I would have lived and died and not had any religious belief, and that seemed perfectly all right. And now that I'm self-aware, I think that I'm self-aware, and when I wasn't self-aware, I wasn't self-aware, and there was no problem. So from the perspective of self-awareness, I don't think that other people should be self-aware, because it happened to me spontaneously, and I think why, I don't know. And so, you know, who am I to say whether people should be self-aware or not? I mean, if you're self-aware, you're self-aware. You're free in that state, as it were, and you can't compare it to anything. It's not like being free in your consciousness, being free to travel, or free to paint pictures, or free to bring up children, and free to make money, and so forth and so on. And that's real freedom within consciousness. And I can't see anything wrong with that. I mean, people that walk around with plenty of money in the bank have a certain freedom that people that are living in ghettos and, you know, poverty, they don't have that kind of freedom. It's just different degrees of freedom. And maybe people that are very poor may have a certain kind of freedom in their emotions, in their affection for one another, in their community, that people with lots of money don't have. So there's different degrees of freedom. And being self-aware is just another kind of freedom, basically. And I think if you're not psychological about your condition, that means you're not psychologically projecting jealousy and envy and hatred and all kinds of negative, violent ideas onto other people, but just accept your condition and live within that condition and do what you can to change that condition if you want to. Maybe not everybody wants to be rich, maybe everybody doesn't want to be poor, or whatever people want. And since I've become self-aware, I mean, that's the condition, that's the reality I live in. I don't have an opinion about it. I don't then think, oh, everybody should be like this, or it's better than something else. It's better than just simply living for what you're identified with. So that I happen to write poetry, I happen to paint pictures, or I have in the past, but I'm not interested in being a poet, I'm not interested in being an artist. And now I'm not interested in being a spiritual person. Although I'm self-aware in the spiritual sense, I don't consider, in the world I live in, to other people, I don't particularly want to be represented as a spiritual identity, a person that people can recognize spiritually. So really my communication is really, I would say, within the framework of spirituality, but from my own perspective, it's really not about spirituality, because there's nothing you can do about spirituality, there's nothing you can do about self-awareness. I mean, when you walk through nature and you see birds and you see other animals, they're independent, they're autonomous, they're doing their own thing, and they live in completely different realities. I mean, the crow is not concerned with the fox. I mean, if the crow's in the tree and the fox is running around, they're two completely different realities. They may overlap, of course, but I'm just saying that the crow's the crow and so forth. And when you see children are children, they're not adults, and the dog is not a cat. So when you're in yourself, you're not the artist, but when you're doing the art, you are the artist as well. But when you're in yourself, you don't have to be the artist if you don't want to be. And when you're listening to music and you're using your consciousness and you're sensing, feeling the music more in your consciousness as an aesthetic experience, etc. Of course, you're hearing it with your body, but your body participates, but it's not about your body, it's about your consciousness, how you feel, and the aesthetics of it. And so you're quite happy to, say, sit in a dark room and watch a good film. You're not thinking of your body and you're not thinking of yourself. It is a spiritual, you're just enjoying, identifying with the personality that's relating to the film and the personalities within the film, the drama within the film. The levels don't contradict each other, they just function differently. And when you're hungry, you physically go in the kitchen and you physically eat the food. When you're watching a film, listening to music, you're more in your psyche and consciousness. And when you're just sitting quiet, looking out of the window as the openness and freedom of the self, then you're not concerned with your consciousness or your body. Just as I say, when you're dreaming, you're not even aware of your physical body. And I'm sure if you went to a transcendental dimension, spiritual dimension, then you wouldn't even be concerned whether there was consciousness or body or physical universe or psychic universe. You'll just live in that reality. I mean, if you're a refugee and you go to another country and you miss your country, you're nostalgic, etc., but your children grow up and in a few generations they're speaking the language and maybe they're politicians, and they no longer refer back to their background in another country. They're completely adapted to the new reality. It's the same way. If we went to other planets and we interbred with other alien intelligences, etc., then eventually we would never think of the Earth and never think of civilization, never think of, what that's all about. We just forget about it. So in our consciousness, one identity can forget about another. So when we're the artist, we're the artist. When we're the parent, we're the parent. And when we're the politician, we're the politician. And if you're self-aware, when you're yourself, when you're sitting quiet, then you're yourself. There's no contradiction. And there's no comparison. So it's not better or worse to be in your body, to be in your psyche, or to be in the spiritual dimension. But people that are idealistic about the spirit inflate it and think it's so much more important to be a Buddha or to be God or something, but it's not. That's a total misconception, because you're imagining and projecting a kind of inflation of your ego, of your identity within your consciousness. That has nothing to do with it. I mean, all the fantasy in the world, or the biology in the world, or the evolution in the world doesn't make you aware of the reality of a bird. The bird that's flying about in the tree doesn't depend on you and your consciousness for its reality, and there's no way that you can know that reality through evolution or through biology or through anything else. And the tree's independent, the bird's independent, nature's independent, the cosmos and the stars are independent, and the only process or figure or entity that we know about that isn't truly indivisible as an individual independent individual, as it were, is the human being. It's only the human being that's confused about its reality and is searching in consciousness for the reality of itself. So we're really the only thing that I can think of in the whole universe so far that isn't actually independent, indivisible as self. So if you came to this planet from another planet and you were enlightened and you came to this planet, you would see that the people on this planet are not enlightened. They don't know self. And they're searching for self in the books, in the films, in the music, in the religions, in evolution, in science. We're searching for ourself in many respects. Or we want to become ourself, or we want to become perfect, we want to become free, we want to become healthy, we want to become independent, but we can't manufacture that within consciousness. So the evolutionists, etc., and the scientists and the atheists, they reduce consciousness to the brain and say there is no self. But that's no different from people that believe in religion in their consciousness. Whether you're a theist or an atheist, neither of them can know self within consciousness. So they're both deceiving themselves in thinking that you can get rid of self, or you can project self as an ideal God or something, but it's in a sense it's both delusional and the illusion of Maya.